Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 30th, where I wanted to talk about the haunting and also prepare us for basically the rest of the semester because believe it or not, we are coming to the end. So I gave an extension for the haunting and the haunting journal, and that is now going to be due on Monday, the 5th of December, 11:59 p.m. Via my email, as usual, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. At this point, I should have returned your Dracula journals to you, and I am in the midst of working on the Lovecraft journals. We are also coming close to our very last major text of this semester. That happens to be The Exorcist. After The Exorcist, we've got just a couple of short stories by Stephen King, just to give the semester a sense of closure. Now, if you've never read The Exorcist before, or if you've never seen the film, I can tell you that it's quite graphic. So, my suggestion for reading the text and also for watching the film is that you can, if you so wanted to, skim through those graphic episodes. That's not going to in any way put you at a disadvantage in terms of analyzing the story itself, which I've always said has been misread and misviewed. That the true story is not about the possessed girl. It is about the exorcist. And in fact, there are two exorcists in this particular story. I think it makes the text much more interesting when we view it from that particular lens. But if you'll remember at the beginning of the semester, Stephen King had talked about in his Danse Macabre the idea of the gross out. And The Exorcist definitely does exemplify the idea of the gross out. And we'll talk a little bit about why William Peter Blatty, the author, decided to take that route. So, the last thing that I wanted to talk about before moving into The Haunting of Hill House is Work to Rule, which you may have heard that faculty and staff are beginning on Wednesday, today, if you're watching this on Wednesday, the 30th. Basically, faculty and staff have been without a new contract for 16 months, and the result of that has been a work action that will be beginning on the 30th called Work to Rule, meaning that we do our jobs, but we don't do anything additional. We work to the letter of the rule of our previous contract. So that said, it shouldn't impact you in any way. This is more about the behind the scenes things that faculty and staff oftentimes do in terms of college governance and in terms of committee work, since teaching is only a piece of our jobs. But again, I wanted you to be aware of it in case you start hearing things about Work to Rule. Now, for The Haunting of Hill House, I am hopeful that you will have completed reading that text as well as watching the film version. And this idea of haunting, yeah, I think about Emily Dickinson's very famous quote that one need not be a chamber to be haunted, which I think works quite well for this particular story and is perhaps one of the reasons why the film didn't call itself The Haunting of Hill House, but just The Haunting, because the characters, especially Ellie, are definitely haunted, both figuratively, but perhaps literally as well. In this text, we see the typical ambiguity that we've seen in Gothic texts, where we can perhaps explain away the events through natural means, but we can also use supernatural elements as a way to quantify the events that occur. Now, the word haunting, haunt means home. So the focus is on the home. Think about the Gothic tradition and the Gothic castle and how Gothic, one of its origins of words, happens to be an architectural term. And hauntings are inexplicable sensory phenomena. They're oftentimes characterized by noises, actually, not by visions, smells, tactile sensations, oftentimes cold. Think about how that plays a role with what we saw with the text. And also poltergeist activity. So, poltergeist is a German word. Polter means to knock, and Geist means spirit. And this is supposed to be a mischievous or a malevolent spirit or energy that oftentimes is characterized by things such as rock throwing. Think about how Ellie talked about her episode when she was a young child about rocks being thrown. Odors, wraps, physical and sexual assaults, shrieking, spontaneous movements of objects, oftentimes associated with a young female, an adolescent female, or a female under the age of 20, perhaps because of a repressed or a unconscious thought or desire, oftentimes associated with the cusp of menstruation. And keep this in mind when we are talking about The Exorcist. And physical disturbances, things like flying, levitating, banging doors, rapping, thumping, assaults on humans, can also be caused by psychokinesis, which is a scientific term for not a supernatural element, but a natural element that still has not yet been understood through science. And this is the power of the mind to influence these actions. So we have the possibility of a supernatural haunting. We have the possibility of poltergeist activity, and we also have the possibility of psychokinetic activity within the text, or perhaps all three. One does not necessarily negate the other. A haunting is, in theory, a possible energy residue that's left behind by the living after they die. That the house retains a kind of memory or is a kind of psychic battery. Something that Stephen King talks about in The Shining, for instance, and that was his conception for the Overlook Hotel. Also, the idea that it could be a possible portal to a spirit dimension that allows spirits to enter the physical world. This is very Lovecraftian. As we know, Lovecraft talked about the idea of different dimensions that were oftentimes accessible through angles, actually, which is why Lovecraft oftentimes discusses angles. And when we think about the Haunting of Hill House, very famous episode of or very famous story associated with the Haunting of Hill House is the Winchester story of the Winchester rifle, which is in California, the Winchester House, which is built in a very odd way. And the story goes that the Winchester heiress to the fortune of the Winchester rifle was told by a psychic that she would basically be tormented by spirits. The only way that she could prevent that was by continually adding on additions to her house. She would be tormented for all of the lives that were taken with the Winchester rifle. And she believed this. I wonder if the psychic perhaps had some connection with a construction company. But nevertheless, she spent her life, Sarah Winchester, building on to this very odd house where you would have staircases that would go into nowhere. The number 13 was oftentimes repeated, things of that nature. And it's supposed to be quite the tourist attraction. And of course, it comes with all kinds of supernatural folklore associated with it. And of course, when we were talking about the Haunting of Hill House and are talking about the Haunting of Hill House itself is based on that idea of the Winchester Mansion. In fact, I'll have a video for you to watch about that as well. But nevertheless, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that we have a central female character, which is something that is unusual over the course of this semester when we've been reading these iconic Gothic texts. We have a character study basically of Eleanor Vance, who is very much repressed. She's been serving as her mother's caretaker and feels a good amount of guilt over her mother's death. She lives with her sister's family, so she's never really had a sense of independence. Interestingly, she lies about her age, and she doesn't make herself younger, she makes herself older. She's 32 and she argues that she's 34. It very much reminds me of what adolescents do, is that they usually add numbers to their age. Remember what I had talked about in terms of poltergeist activity oftentimes being associated with adolescence. And in many ways, Ellie is an adolescent, even though she is of an adult age. She's awkward, she's sheltered, she's prone to fantasy. And of course, she's adding numbers onto her age rather than subtracting. We learned that when she was 12, there was some sort of supernatural or psychic or telekinetic phenomenon associated after her father's death, that stones fell on the house. Again, that's oftentimes associated with telekinetic or poltergeist activity. And we're introduced to another lead female character, Theodora, known as Theo, again, a male nickname. And this will be important in terms of some of the dynamics between the two. She's the exact opposite of Ellie. Theo is independent and confident and graceful. And supposedly she's at Hill House because she's had an argument with a friend that she lives with. This text is oftentimes read through a queer lens, that basically there's sexual tension between Ellie and Theo. And of course, Ellie is very inexperienced sexually. And I'll get to a passage that would seem to suggest this in a few moments. Theo's ability is that she's able to telepathically identify cards in a lab in an experiment. Telepathy is basically the various transmission of information without using any sensory channels. So the opening quote to Hill House, which helps to establish the mood, one of my favorites. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality, that even larks and catechids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within it. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand so for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. And notice the similarity of the ending, so that this story comes full circle. And in fact, again, talking about the idea of Hill House itself as an eccentricity, that it has circular passages. If you know anything about Dante's Inferno, you'll also know that that was based on a circular construction. And again, that is supposed to bring forth images of the Winchester house as well. Some of the other characters that we're introduced to, Dr. Montague, who's a kind of ridiculous Van Helsing figure. He rents Hill House for 3 months. We've already talked about the significance of 3 in terms of Trinity. Except this time he's forced to search for assistance, unlike Victorian times. So this is definitely a wink and a nod to the way things have changed over the time of Dracula, when individuals can just drop all of their responsibilities and go vampire hunting. And he's very much the henpecked husband. Mrs. Montague serves for more as a humorous element in the text. We note that the film took some liberties, as films oftentimes do, created more of a love tension interest between Montague and Ellie, rather than addressing something that could be considered to be more taboo, which would be Ellie and Theo. And we had talked a little bit about this with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as well. And then Hill House is in this isolated rural area. Of course, we know isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. And its description is quite Gothic, that even though it's a house, it's very castle-like, with towers and turrets and buttresses, spires and gargoyles. Gargoyles were basically used to scare away spirits. They were used in cathedrals, for instance. These odd angles that I was referencing earlier, personification of elements, window-like eyes, very much reminds me of Poe in some respects, cornice eyebrows, doors swinging shut. And we can see the door literally, but we can also see it symbolically, the door to the psyche, something that we talked about with Jekyll and Hyde as well. And that circular nature, again, as I was referencing with Dante's Inferno. And it comes with a tragic history. And with tales of hauntings, usually ghost stories are quite subtle. We saw that with Monkey's Paw, the British tradition of the ghost story, but we can also see this in terms of Hill House. That comes with a tragic history that the last tenant died driving into a driveway tree. Keep that in mind when we think about Ellie and the ending of this text. That all tenants leave hastily. That the builder, Hugh Crane, his first wife, died in a driveway carriage accident. Again, think about what happens to Ellie at the end there. The second wife died of a fall. And think about how Ellie climbs the library stairs and almost Falls. The third wife died of consumption in Europe. And think about how we talked about the consumption being oftentimes mistaken for vampirism in Victorian times. The quarreling sibling heirs about heirlooms and inheritances, which are oftentimes associated with hauntings, that there's some sort of unfinished business in the living world, and that's one of the reasons why hauntings occur. The older sister died in the house with a companion who neglected her. Again, think about the parallels with Ellie neglecting her own mother. And then the companion willed the house and ultimately hung herself from the tower turret. So the rooms of Hill House are named after colors, which was not necessarily that unusual when you've got these large places that had so many rooms that they needed to be differentiated from one another. But I do think of the Mask of Red Death as well, and Poe, and naming rooms after colors. The group plays chess. I think that's very important thematically, because basically this idea of game playing, and the house is basically playing games with the tenants, and this idea that all of the party, they're much like chess pieces being moved around by the house. Or perhaps they're being moved around by Ellie, which we'll talk about in a moment. They spend their time doing things like reading mystery stories, how appropriate, because ultimately we know that Poe was the creator of the modern day mystery in the way that we think of it. And also reading Pamela, which is a little bit of an in joke for people with backgrounds in literature. Pamela is a very long and boring English novel. So this goes to show that they've got a lot of time on their hands. Mrs. Dudley, one of my favorite characters, represents order. She clears breakfast at 10, lunch is at 1, dinner is 6. She's the exact antithesis of Hill House, which is basically not about order itself. Now, Ellie, we see the text through her eyes, which means that we have to be suspicious because as a narrator, she is somewhat unreliable. She has lots of adolescent behavior. Again, lying not only about her age, but having her own apartment. She lives very much in a fantasy world, and fantasy becomes reality for her very easily, and reality can become fantasy for her very easily. She wants the car. That's one of the first elements of conflict that we see in this particular text, that she's fighting with her sister for the car, saying that it's half hers. I can't think of anything more adolescent than wanting access to a car, which represents independence and freedom. Her fear constantly of being left out, of being an outsider, always concerned about what her mother would say or what her mother would think, and always concerned about what others will say about her when she's not around. And again, very self-centered, very I-centric. We find out at the very beginning that basically Ellie is alone. She is living with her sister's family. She's not particularly wanted. She has never had an opportunity to be independent because she's been her mother's caretaker. So this is the first time that something is ever going to happen to her, as she puts it, when she goes to Hill House. And she has a very interesting incident on her way where she runs into an old lady who's carrying groceries. And the old woman says that she'll pray for Ellie. And I suspect she might be the only one praying for Ellie, again, because Ellie is so isolated and alone, is basically looking for companionship, is looking for family, is looking for belonging. It's one of the reasons why she goes to Hill House. I think it's quite telling that she goes with all of her belongings in a box. That says two things. The first, how little she owns, that all of her belongings can be put in a box. And secondly, she doesn't intend to return to her sister's house, or else she wouldn't have put all of her belongings in a box. Now, of course, we learn about her supernatural and paranormal history when 12 stones rained on the house. And we see right at the very beginning how she's absorbed in her fantasy world. She sees the word daredevil, which basically means dare to evil, or to dare evil, which is something that could be considered a kind of foreshadowing as Ellie is on her way to Hill House. She continually repeats the phrase, journeys end in lovers meeting. And one might say that this is her intent in going to Hill House, is to find a lover. Whether that happened to be Luke, or it happened to be Theo, or it happens to be the house itself. continually seeking verification of her existence. So you can see how tenuous her hold is on reality. And as she drives on going to Hill House, we learn a little bit, about some of her reflections about life. The first, when she stops for some coffee, she sees a family and a little girl demanding a cup of stars. And Ellie thinks to herself that the little girl should continue to demand drinking out of her cup of stars, because once she accommodates to the majority and doesn't, then she loses her independence and voice. And the quote is, once they've trapped you into being like everyone else, you'll never see your cup of stars again. Now, keep in mind as well how ultimately suicide is so important in this particular text, which we could say is what Ellie does at the ending as she crashes her car into the driveway tree, or perhaps again she's being manipulated through supernatural elements. The setting is the first shining day of summer, but June 21st, the summer solstice, also known as midsummer, is a very pagan day. It's known for fertility and fertility rites. And Shirley Jackson supposedly indicated that she was a practicing witch, but she was very much aware of paganism and supernatural elements and would embed them within her text. Ellie turns left when she's following the directions. Left is supposed to represent evil. And she's traveling west, which is where there's sunsets. And again, you could say that this is the ending of Ellie's life. Fear, this is one of my favorite quotes on page 159 in the edition that I had ordered for us as a class, is the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishing of reasonable patterns, which I think is a wonderful way of sort of characterizing fear as we've examined fear over the course of the semester. And then Luke talks a little bit about what we fear most is perhaps we fear seeing ourselves clearly and without disguise. So I can let you sort of ponder that over the text that we've read this semester. It's also a question I raise in my horror film class as well. Think about some of the stories that they tell to entertain each other. That Ellie had freckles. She was often sick with cold. She fell during her graduation procession. Think about how much in contrast that is to Theo's history, where she attended private schools. She learned how to curtsy. She attended dances and she performed in operetta. And then some of the fantasies that Ellie creates when she talks about some fictional stories, that she's an artist model in love, living a mad and abandoned life, and her affairs are the talk of the cafes. And think about how affairs can mean business affairs, but they can also mean sexual affairs. And definitely there is this sense that Ellie has been and is sexually repressed, which could be some of the reasons for poltergeist phenomenon, or also could be some of the reasons for some of the haunting phenomenon that occurs. So these polar opposites of Theo and Ellie, where Theo is graceful while Ellie is awkward, while Theo is confident while Ellie is insecure, while Theo is independent while Ellie is dependent, and while Theo is uninhibited and Theo is repressed, so much so that she thinks it's actually scandalous that she would bring a pair of pants rather than a skirt to Hill House. And what would her mother think about that? Again, continually thinking about her mother. When Ellie asks if Theo is married, Theo first responds with silence and then laughs and says no. And again, Theo is there at Hill House, supposedly because of an argument with a, quote, friend, unquote. But I draw your attention to a quote on page 174. This happens to be the version that I'm using. Quote, nothing irrevocable had yet been spoken, but there was the barest margin of safety left them, each of them moving delicately along the outskirts of an open question, and once spoken, such a question as, quote, do you love me, unquote, could never be answered or forgotten. They walked slowly, walking side by side in the most extreme intimacy of expectation. Their fainting and hesitation done with, they could only await passively for resolution. Each knew, almost within a breath, what the other was thinking and waiting to say. Each of them almost wept for the other. Of course, this is when Theo and Ellie are walking together alone. So some of the quotes that I'll be addressing next class will be haunted house lore on page 70 in my version, almost like Dracula helping to establish the rules of vampire. We'll see how Shirley Jackson does the same with haunted house lore. The importance of Ouija boards and planchettes, which is something that we will also see in The Exorcist. That's on page 187. The message on the wall that can be interpreted in so many ways. Help Eleanor come home. Notice this message doesn't have punctuation, and because of that, based on where we would put punctuation, this message could have multiple meanings. And of course, the Ouija board messages of home and waiting and mother and lost. So as I indicated, I had a short documentary for you to watch about the Winchester House. So I've got that in our notes below. And for our attendance question, which would be due on the 2nd of December, which is Friday at 8 a.m. And as you know, you're not required to read, or you're not required to respond to the responses of your peers, but you are required to read all the responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a sense of what we would have discussed in class. And certainly if you need additional time to respond to the discussion question, just ask me for an extension. What do you think is the explanation for the events at Hill House and why? What do you think is the explanation of the events at Hill House and why? And again, next class, we'll talk a little bit about some quotation and move into The Exorcist. And I leave you with watching a little bit of the documentary about the Winchester House. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.